We're live right now. So, hi, my name is Reilly. I work here at Fossil Creek Nursery. Um, I'm I'm an ecologist. I have an ecology degree, and nursery professional here. So today we're going to be talking about compost, just kind of like compost basics. Um, that might seem like an odd topic this in the middle of winter. There's all this snow on the ground right now, but gardening season is a lot closer than it seems right now. It's only going to be a couple weeks until people are going to start the first steps of getting their garden ready, and having a good compost setup is going to be one of those first steps that you'll want to have. So it's something to think about early on in the gardening season. And it's also a process that once it gets rolling, it's kind of year round. Your garden might go dormant, so to speak, over the winter, but your compost doesn't really need to. So it'll just become sort of a self-sustaining process. So I thought I'd give a brief overview of why compost at all, and there's like we talked about it being useful for the garden. It's also useful for the environment. There's a lot of perfectly compostable waste products that the average American home produces. A lot of food waste, paper products, things like that normally just wind up in the landfill, where they kind of just don't give back to the environment in any way. But you could just compost them as they would in nature, just out in the soil, just decomposing and providing a more healthy soil community, putting nutrients back into the soil. So it's a good way to reduce your household waste. And you can take these household waste products, and through composting you can turn them into really useful, all natural organic fertilizer. It's something that's very useful for the garden, vegetable gardens, even flower gardens. It's also useful for your lawn. If you have enough compost or a small enough lawn, you can just top dress your lawn with compost in the spring, or if you're putting new seed in. It works its way into the soil, and it brings with it nutrients, as well as microorganisms and little invertebrates, worms, things of that nature, that really build up a healthy soil community that can really kickstart plants, especially out here in Colorado. We're in the high desert. It's not always the easiest place to grow plants. It also ameliorates the water retention in your soil. You don't want a soil that just locks in all the moisture and becomes soggy and stays soggy, but you also don't want soil where the water just drains away and disappears. And so out here we usually have more of the former. We have that thick clay, so compost helps sort of break up, aerate the soil, kind of allow space for water to move around, so you don't have water just pooling in one place, which plants don't tend to like. But yeah, that's kind of the basics of why we would want to compost. But I'm sure most people are already familiar with the idea of composting as, a thing that you can and should be doing for your garden. But a lot of people might hear that and then wonder, well, how do I do it? And then that's the exciting part, because it's really, really easy. In nature, it just happens on its own. Bits of discarded plants and dead plant material, they fall on the ground and they naturally decompose. Sometimes it takes a couple years, sometimes it takes a couple weeks, and they just sort of decompose back into the soil, and you create this rich, it's called humus, the sort of very dense organic soil. And yeah, in nature that just happens on its own, so it doesn't take too much pushing and prodding to have it happen in a more controlled setting in your garden. We'd say there's four main components to good compost, and those would be nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and water. And the nitrogen and the carbon, that's the waste component. That's what you're taking that normally you would be throwing away. We call those the greens, nitrogen, and the browns, carbon. And you want to have a pretty even balance of those, because that's what That's what your microbes and your fungi and your worms and such are going to be breaking down. So when we talk about greens, the nitrogen, that's, vegetable scraps, tea bags, grass clippings, things of that nature. And then the browns, the carbon, that's more a lot of paper products. If you have especially brown paper, newsprint, stuff that doesn't have too many weird dyes or bleaches or waxes in it, as well as dried leaves, even wood chips, things like that, like shredded yard waste. That's a really good source of carbon. And so you just sort of you get those products and you blend them together. Then the other components being oxygen and water. The oxygen is necessary for the microbes that are breaking down these products. They want some oxygen to because they need it to breathe, just like we do. And so we usually say when you have your compost, and we'll talk about the different ways that you can set up your compost, if it's a heap or a bin or a pile or something else. The general idea is that you're going to need to turn it in some way, like rotate it. And sometimes that's literally like you get a pitchfork and you just turn over the pile to aerate it so that there's oxygen moving throughout it. Or there's some, they're called tumblers. It's a large barrel that's kind of on a stand and you can just crank it and turn it over itself. Which is a pretty easy way. Why we want to get oxygen in there is because when there's not oxygen, the compost sits on a big pile and it kind of presses down on itself, and this can cause anaerobic microbes to come in and do some anaerobic decomposition, which it's not bad per se. It's just not going to go, it's not going to turn your pile of kitchen scraps into compost. It's going to turn your pile of kitchen scraps into a pile of rotten kitchen scraps. And that's generally, if you're getting like odors and you're attracting critters and things into your compost bin, that's probably a sign that it's not getting enough oxygen, because it's just kind of rotting. And it's a fairly reversible process. If it's getting gross, you can turn your compost more and it should settle back down pretty quickly. The other thing to keep in mind, so we talked about nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and then water is the other thing, which you don't necessarily have to think of everywhere in the country and everywhere in the world, but here in Colorado, where the air is really dry, you want to keep that in mind. You want your compost to be not like sopping wet, like not like soggy, but just like a little bit moist at any given time. So sometimes that means you take it out and you turn it and you notice, this is pretty dry, and you just run the hose on it for a little bit, fill up a bucket, and put some water in there. The water is helpful for a lot of the more delicate organisms, like some of the nematodes and the smaller bacteria and yeast and stuff that would come in. They dry out pretty easily, and then they'll either go dormant. They might like form a cyst or something, or like a spore, and just kind of shut off, or they would just actually die or retreat back into the soil. Earthworms are known for that too. But that's kind of the thing to keep in mind. You keep those in balance. And when it comes to balancing like your nitrogen and carbon, which is sort of the main thing that you're producing from the household waste, there's not a lot of math that you're doing. I find that when I'm composting and when my friends that compost, we don't really keep track. We find we don't really need to, between the balance. Just the average American family is, you'll be producing a decent mix of what you need for compost. I think the main thing to consider is there are a lot of things are compostable. Like many organic waste products are compostable, but some of them you don't want in your compost for like personal use. The main things we'd say would be like fats, oils, greases, animal products in general, like meat, especially meat and dairy. We would say to avoid in the compost. Now that's not because they're not inherently compostable, just like lots of fats and oils and greases that's sort of riding the line, but things like meat and dairy, they're perfectly compostable. You might not want to do that in your garden setting because it's going to be pretty gross. There will be, those decompositions are going to be a little bit more smelly, and you will probably attract some unwanted attention from raccoons and rats and things. So, but we'll actually come back to that later. There are ways that you can compost those trickier products, and some services that do that. There are some settings where that can actually work pretty well. The other thing to consider would be pet waste, like dog poop and stuff. You definitely don't want to put that in your compost, mostly because we use compost as, you're going to be using it as fertilizer, and potentially for things that you might be eating, for your vegetable crops and whatnot. And so you could pass pathogens on different diseases, parasites, things that might be in your dog poop that may or may not survive the composting process and then would still be present in the finished compost, and it's best not to get involved with that. But that is a good thing to note, that one of the processes that happens while it's composting, you get these microbial communities moving in, and one of the things that happens as they're feeding and breaking down these products is that they'll release heat. So your compost will begin to get hot. And that's one of the fun things about composting this time of year. In the winter, you can go and see that your compost is still working and still effective, even in the middle of a snowstorm. I do this sometimes when I'm turning my compost bin in the winter. You turn it over and it's just steaming, which is really exciting to see, and you can know that it's still happening. You don't always... You won't see steam in the middle of summer when it's like 85 degrees outside, but it's more noticeable in the winter, which is kind of fun. So with that in mind, you've got your idea of the products, the things that you can compost. The how necessarily is that's a little bit more open. So we'll talk about that for a little bit. There's a lot of different products that people use, like compost bins. There's you can put your compost in a bin of sorts. You can put it in a pile. I usually just use a pile. That's just a personal choice, but there's a lot of you can buy compost bins, just like large plastic bins, or like we talked about, the tumblers, which is sort of a barrel that's up on a little stand and then with a crank, so you can turn it to aerate it. It's up to you, really. I think the main considerations that if you have an open bin or heap, you may need to be a little bit more concerned about, like, well, when you dump in a load of like kitchen scraps, for that time being until you turn it over and it starts to decompose, well, you have just dropped a bunch of banana peels, celery clippings, tea bags, things of that nature. So if you have a particularly ambitious squirrel population, or maybe a dog in the backyard, they might be digging around in there a little bit, and if you want to avoid that, an enclosed bin might be an easier situation. But ultimately, it's very much up to just what you have in your personal space and your scale. For people that don't have a backyard and don't have room to have something, this is actually my situation. I don't have a backyard, so what I do is I collect my compostables in a series of buckets, and then when the buckets are full, I take them to my friend's property, who has sort of a big communal compost heap, and so we use it there. But you can also, there's a smaller plastic compost bins that could fit on a patio. There's also something called Vermicompost, which is, people may have heard of this. That's compost that is, you cultivate like a colony of earthworms in a small container, and that's something that is small scale enough that you could fit that like under your kitchen sink, that whole setup. The drawback being that it is very small scale, and because the earthworms don't necessarily work as fast as a giant communal colony of lots of different microbes, you really can't put in the large amounts of waste products into that you could with other things. But With that, and speaking of worms, that's people might ask, is there some trick to getting compost started? How does it go from just being a pile of like rotten like little pieces of bread and like vegetables and things? How does that turn into fertilizer? Well, that's how you get that's the microbial community that gets involved. And the great thing about soil is that it's absolutely full of these microbes. They say, I had a microbiology professor that said that if you took a soil sample from any given location and you sequenced all the microbes that would be in there, there would be billions of different species of little bacteria and fungi, most of them never discovered by science before. And then you could walk 10 feet in any direction, take another soil sample, you would get probably a completely different billion microbes. Also, most of which never been sequenced or identified before. So they are all over the place. So that's it's very easy to get that started. So if you have an enclosed bin that's not in contact with the soil, it's just as easy as you get your shovel, you take a scoop of soil just out of your yard from right next to the compost bin and just put that in at the bottom of your compost bin when you start putting stuff in, and there will be enough worm eggs and fungus and stuff in there to keep it going. If you think that maybe your compost is stalled out or it's kind of stopped, you put more stuff, you keep putting stuff in and it doesn't seem like it's really doing anything and it's kind of getting gross, you could put more soil in there to sort of kickstart it a little bit. And then if you just have a pile, something that's in direct contact with the soil, then you're good to go. Every night, earthworms and the more delicate things like nematodes and stuff will come up out of the soil, swim around in your compost, and then probably during the day when it's hotter and drier, they'll go back down into the soil. If you have a big enough pile, they may stay in there continuously, and then your compost will go really fast. But it's the great thing about compost is that it's a self-regulating process. It just kind of goes, and which is what I think is so fun about it. It's there's an idea of gardening as like an active process that you're doing, and like, oh, I have to go weed the garden, I have to plant the garden, and managing the garden. And composting feels more collaborative, like you're collaborating with nature itself, as opposed to like sometimes, especially in the middle of the summer, it can feel like you're doing battle with your garden, with the weeds and keeping the birds out and keeping the squirrels out. But compost always, to me at least, feels more collaborative with nature, and I think that's kind of fun. It lets you feel a little bit more connected. But that's kind of a brief run through of how we would talk about compost and how we'd make it. But like I said, there are so many different products and methods for this, that it's really any way that you can think of just having those basic, your nitrogen source, your carbon source, put it together, get some natural soil from your yard in there, and then turn it and make sure it doesn't dry out too much. And as long as you're following those basic guidelines, then you're good to go. You can kind of do it any which way that you need to. And then I'd say it can take maybe a couple months, couple weeks, depending on how big your scale is, to get really good compost out of the end. I usually, when my compost is ready to harvest, it gets to a point where I can't really identify anything in it that looks like the stuff I was putting in. I can't see my eggshells anymore. I can't see like the tops of bell peppers anymore. It's all just kind of brown dirt. And you can also, what we do sometimes is when we're ready to take stuff out of our communal compost bin, we'll sift it, just to get any other chunks, just so it has a finer consistency. That's entirely up to you. But yeah, and in general, when compost is really ready to go, it's not really going to smell like anything. You'll definitely smell a little bit of, not necessarily like a really rotten smell, because that's when you know that it's either not getting enough oxygen or it's getting too much water or something is going wrong. But it will have a sort of like funk to it when it's going, because you are decomposing things in there, so stuff is being broken down. but when it's done, it's kind of just gonna smell like dirt or soil, and that's a good indicator of when it's done. Um, but I feel like I should also mention, because we talked about some people don't have space, like some people don't have a yard, they don't have maybe the time to get that set up, or they're in a situation where they would like to compost but they can't. And what's kind of cool is in the last couple years, these services have developed these home composting services where it's sort of like a subscription based service. They give you containers, like big buckets, and you put your kitchen waste and like paper waste and things, all compostable products, into these containers, and then when they're full, you put them outside, and it's kind of like a milk delivery or something. These people will come by and pick up the compost and take it to their like industrial scale composting facilities. And that's really cool for people that like I said, don't have the resources or the space to get a traditional compost setup going. But like I mentioned earlier, there are some things that are technically compostable, but you probably don't want in your home compost. Things like meat and dairy and things like that would normally attract pests into your home setting that you might not want. This is a way that you can compost some of those things. Also, the more like those compostable plastic cups that you see in coffee shops now, they're compostable, but it's probably not going to work in your home compost setup. It needs a more specific and controlled environment. And these composting services, they have the resources. They have this huge setup that's more enclosed, where they can compost those things for you. So it's a good way to maximize the amount of waste products that are being diverted from the landfill and are going back to being something useful. And then these compost services, they bring you like a load at the beginning of gardening season, sometimes more than once a year. They'll bring you the compost that everyone has sort of contributed to, and then you get it back, and you can use it, and you don't have to mess with it at all. It just shows up, which is kind of fun. So that's the bulk of the material that I wanted to go over. This is, kind of an introduction. I can talk about soil microbes all day, but that's maybe beyond the purview of this discussion. But I do have time for questions. If anybody had any questions, we're live in a couple places, so I could talk about those. I guess I'll do some housekeeping business too while we see if anyone wants to ask anything. We have a couple more classes coming up. Like, we have a lot actually. The next one being on February 2nd, another virtual course that's planning your perennials. So we'll be doing that same time, just here on Instagram and Facebook Live, and talking about just getting ready to set up a perennial flower garden, ideas of like what to put where, and soil preparation, things we have to be conscious of in this climate and in this part of the country, things like that. And so that's pretty exciting. Perennials are always really fun. That's one of my favorite things to do at the nursery, is when someone comes in with a picture of a big empty yard and they say, we want flowers. And like, well, let's get into it. So looking forward to that on February 2nd. There's another bonsai course coming up that next weekend, February 5th. Those bonsai courses are really not to be missed. It's very intensive, very you block out maybe like 2 or 3 hours, and we really get into it. You'll get to learn about the history and the culture of bonsai, and then you get to take one home. But yeah, that's I think that's kind of what we had for today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Yeah, I hope this was at least a little informative, and yeah, I suppose we'll see you next time here at Fossil Creek Nursery.